Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and we're in day 4 of the Global Education Conference. And we're in our 4th back-to-back keynote of the morning, well, morning in the Americas, but this has been a really full day, and we have a huge number of sessions today. We're just so appreciative of the volume of support and engagement and enthusiasm for the conference. And we're really delighted to have Michael Trucano here. Michael, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are.
Thanks, Michael. We will have people floating in from the other sessions that we recognize that things don't happen immediately at the top of each hour, but really delighted to have you here. And where are you in the world right now?
I'm in Doha, in Qatar, in the Middle East.
As are several who have been participating in the conference, and really delighted that you take the time to do so. What time is it there?
The time here is a little bit after 8 in the evening.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks to the supporters and sponsors for the conference. Really delighted again at the outpouring of support and enthusiasm. This is the 3rd year of the Global Education Conference. 425 sessions over the course of 5 days, and we have many people to thank for that, including those listed on this slide, and an incredible group of volunteer moderators, partners, and advisory board members. So really huge appreciation to everyone. So we recognize that this is a little bit of a studio audience. We're going to give you a chance to indicate where you're participating from. Look to the links at the left of the map. You're looking for the star. Double-click on that and then click on the map. For those of you who are participating live, it's a chance for you to tell us where you're from. We know we have members from over 180 countries in the conference network, which is phenomenal just in and of itself, and we'd love to see it represented on the map at the start of a session. Please feel free to keep putting that in the chat as we move forward, and welcome new attendees as they come in. Encourage them to let us know where they're from as they do so. Thank you so much for being here. Michael, the time is now yours. We do want to finish on time, and so if you want to do Q&A, feel free to call on me. I'm glad to help assist with that.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Steve. Thanks a lot, everyone. Please let me know in the chat if you can't hear me. I'm going to talk to you today about some things about technologies in education you may not want to hear, or perhaps maybe you want to hear, but some other people may not want to hear. But I'm going to say them. I'm going to say them anyway. My job is to help the World Bank and our development partners. But actually, if you're not familiar with the World Bank is a multilateral international institution. We're part of the UN family. We work with middle and low-income countries around the world across a whole variety of sectors. I work in the education sector, helping ministries of education think about how they might use technology productively, efficiently, cost-effectively in pursuit of whatever educational goals they may have. So I do that with the World Bank, and I do that with ministries of education around the world. Trying to help them get smart, although I think they're pretty smart, so maybe just a little bit smarter about, well, appropriate, relevant, effective, and just as importantly, inappropriate, irrelevant, and ineffective uses of technologies to aid a wide variety of developmental objectives, including and especially those in the education sector. Asking ourselves, asking each other, what do we know about using technology in education in middle and low-income countries, especially what do we know about using it effectively, and what do we know about using it ineffectively. So I'm often asked to share best practice from around the world. And best practice is I think a concept many of us are familiar with. I'm actually not that comfortable using it, especially in this area, because best practice in so many circumstances is specific to a specific need, a specific developmental context. So I prefer to talk really about good practice, and we share a lot of those. But we found that just as importantly, in some cases, unfortunately, even more importantly, we find that sharing worst practice can actually bring about more positive results more quickly. So I put together, just to start off, some 10 worst practices that we see regularly around the world, and we may ask ourselves why these are so. And you're welcome to ask those questions. Now, how did I choose these worst practices, if you will? I had a few criteria for selection. First, they had to be obvious. They had to be right there staring you right in front of your face. In fact, they had to be staring multiple people in front of their faces in many different places around the world. And they had to repeat. These things happen over and over again, unfortunately. So what are these worst practices that we see repeated in many places around the world? First, and this is really the classic worst practice, and if there's only one worst practice around that we could talk about, it's this one. I'm sure everyone is familiar with this. Dump hardware in schools, hope for magic to happen. This should be obvious, I guess, why this is a bad idea, and yet this is something we see over and over again around the world. In the last 2 weeks, I've spoken with 2 ministers of education who have approached us and said, we really want to computerize our schools and put lots of computers in our schools. And in trying to unpack the reasons for that, the basic answer has been, we can't really articulate the reason, we just know it's important. And we see this as a recipe for disaster, perhaps not surprisingly in many places. Number 2, design for a developed country learning environment and implement elsewhere. So take something that's worked, take a model or solution, if you will, that's worked in Chicago or Sydney or Berlin, and think the exact same model will be relevant and useful in Pretoria or in Quito or in Kinshasa or in Colombo, Sri Lanka. This is something we see often. Groups with the best of intentions say, we have something that worked in our school district, for example, in this place, and we want to give it to you, or we want to help you do the same thing. And we find that this is, let's say, problematic in many circumstances. Number 3, think about content only after you've rolled out your hardware. Again, this should seem an obviously bad, if not worse, practice. Yet we find over and over again that it's only after lots of hardware has been purchased and installed in many schools that there's really serious consideration of what you're going to do with it. Now, in some cases, this is a calculated sort of bureaucratic maneuver, trying to use up an entire budget first and then put pressure on perhaps the Ministry of Finance to say, now we need more support to do what it is we wanted to do in the first place, now that we've spent all the money on hardware. But as you can imagine, this is a rather precarious risk to undertake, and it's rather a gamble. Number 4, assume you could just, and this is related, assume you could just import content from somewhere else. We're big fans of things like Khan Academy and all sorts of free open educational resources that are available around the world, as well as lots of things from educational publishers. But we've seen lots of places saying, there's a whole set of free content, we can just use that, and not thinking about how it can be contextualized, made relevant to teachers, meeting their specific curricular objectives in the context of a specific lesson or over a course of study. And we see this as worst practice, number 4. Number 5, don't monitor, don't evaluate. This is another classic worst practice. We see very little interest in doing serious, rigorous research about the impact of a lot of educational technology use in middle and low-income countries, and we even see, unfortunately, insufficient just monitoring of what's actually happening. This also, unsurprisingly, can be a recipe for disaster. Number 6, make a big bet on an unproven technology, especially one based on a closed standard or proprietary standard, or make a big bet on a single vendor, and then don't think you're going to get how you're going to get out of it if things go wrong. We see this continue to happen over and over again. I imagine many of the folks here in the room can cite numerous examples. I will refrain from citing specific examples, but you are all free to do so if you wish. And number 7, don't think about total cost of ownership issues or calculations. we typically see a lot of budgeting go into the initial purchase. The initial purchase of hardware, of software, initial costs for teacher training, but these tend to neglect a lot of the more fundamental costs that you need to sustain and really realize these investments over time. In the corporate sector, we know that, well, there are various calculations, but anywhere between 10 to 25% of IT-related investments actually relate to the capital cost or the initial cost. We don't have good statistics for total costs of operation in developing countries, but from what we see, we expect that they are about in the same range as well. Number 8, assume away equity issues. Just assume that what you do will work the same way in the city as it works in the country, the same way that with boys and girls, the same way for linguistic minorities or for children with special needs as it will with students from dominant linguistic populations. This is also a recipe for disaster. It's something that we see happen over and over again, though. Places like Uruguay, where they've decided to first invest sort of down and out in rural areas and lower socioeconomic levels, and then figured they could scale that up and in to more advantaged environments. That's something we see as a real exception to this, unfortunately, rule of worst practice that we see in many cases. Number 9, don't train your teachers or your school headmasters, school principals, for that matter. This should be obvious, I would imagine, to everyone here in the room. But we see insufficient teacher training, certainly insufficient teacher training over time. Teaching teachers how to use basic office applications one time in a special environment and then sending them back in school with not a lot of guidance and even less support over time to figure out how they can utilize these new tools in ways that are relevant to their teaching and in their classroom. So that's 9. And now number 10. I've left number 10, I guess, blank. I imagine all of you have seen some worst practices where you work as well. So I left that blank. Feel free to contribute those as you wish. Number 10s, I guess, come in many shapes and sizes all around the world, depending where you're from. There's, I guess, a whole set of number 10s from the soccer or football world there. And here's our list of worst practices as well, with number 10 omitted at the end. And it's great to see a number of the, or perhaps not so great to see a number of these worst practices flying by in the chat room as well. So what good is it to talk about worst practice? One is to remind ourselves of things perhaps we shouldn't do. And unfortunately, we see over and over again these things practiced. And even here, I'm in Doha this week for a big conference of about 1,200 people from around the world, education leaders, innovators. And the number of times I've heard people suggest things for action that sounds suspiciously like the 9 things that I just mentioned is rather troubling, I guess, to say the least. But for those of us who work in educational technology, which I imagine most of what everyone here does, these things won't be new. And if you're new to this whole area, you may say, this is obvious stuff. Why do we need to be mentioned? Why do you even need to talk about it? But if it's so obvious, unfortunately, why do we see it happening? Why do we see it reoccurring with really depressing regularity? This is a question I think that I ask myself over and over again. And perhaps there's some reasons. Perhaps there's some reasons that you have found or can surmise. Some of it might have to do with the fact that there are things we don't want to admit. We sell perhaps our ideas or these investments in ways, even when we're not comfortable with where we're selling them, because we know that, or we feel that the real reason we're doing them is too complicated, perhaps, for the decision makers who need to make the investments to understand. And so I can understand that impulse, but it's unfortunate. So what are some of these things we know about using technology in education, perhaps we know implicitly but don't want to admit? Now, this is an exercise I go through with policymakers pretty regularly to at least highlight some things or challenge some of the conventional wisdom that they perhaps have and see if in doing so and provoking them in some way, maybe we can come to some useful conclusions or useful courses of action. And so I'm being deliberately provocative here. I may believe, I may not believe everything I'm going to say to you in the next couple minutes, but here goes. Now, computer labs. Computer labs are a bad idea. Now, I don't know that computer labs themselves are a bad idea, but what we see around the world over and over again are, especially in middle and low-income countries, are computer labs segregated away from where the most regular teaching and learning happens in the classroom, oftentimes overlooked by a computer teacher who has the key to the door, which might be locked. Now, that's not to say that all uses of computer labs are wrong, but the default use of computer labs, or the default choice of putting all computers in a room is one I think we should consider. Now, whether it's because we need to protect it or climate control the situation, or we're worried about theft, those are all understandable, but as a default, I think, choice, this is something that we should perhaps reconsider. Number two, IC literacy classes are a bad idea. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't train people on the basic mechanics of how to use your technology, but oftentimes we find that courses or instruction on, let's say, the mechanics of technology operation, once you have that, that tends to divert both attention and funding from other types of, let's say, training, other types of skills development that may even be more useful. You can, in many cases, teach the basic mechanics of technology use in ways while you're trying to explore various curricular objectives and not have to devote specific time, perhaps specific time in the computer lab itself just to develop ICT literacy. Now, ICT literacy broadly, more broadly defined, is not something we're against or we argue against. It's saying that perhaps to narrowly define ICT literacy, you may want to think about how and why you're doing it. Number three, if you're going to make a big investment in technology, don't expect your test scores to improve. Now, I get lots and lots of research papers, and I'll put research in quotation marks here, from vendors and from companies really touting almost incredible advances in test scores of various sorts after the introduction of their technology. And, you know, maybe some of these are true. Oftentimes the science behind these studies are, let's say, rather problematic. But even where there is an improvement in test scores, sometimes we may have to ask ourselves, are these good tests? And if they're not good tests, we really care that we're raising achievement against a marker that really is the inappropriate one. In some places they've said that the introduction of technology needs to bring about a new type of assessment. Sure, fair enough. But be careful about quick promises improvement of test scores. Now, number four, what students do outside the classroom with technology is more important than what they do inside it. I say this not to diminish the use of technology in schools, but just to say that most students, many students, or even some students have access to different types of technologies that they use to explore the world, that they use perhaps to learn outside of school environments. And if you're making decisions about technology use in schools, you're really making them based on insufficient or inadequate attention to all sets of lessons and inputs that might be relevant to how you actually use them in school. You know, there's a popular saying, Mark Prensky made it popular, that technology is revolutionizing education everywhere but inside the classroom. Now, whether or not that's true, it's certainly undeniable that what happens, what students, what kids do with technology outside the classroom may well be relevant to what they do inside of it. Number five, digital citizenship and child digital safety will become an important part of what schools teach. Now, you may say, oh, we agree with this. And the policymakers I talked to, they would nod their head immediately. And why I say they don't want to hear this is because so few of them are doing anything really substantial about this. Sure, there may be filters in schools. There may be acceptable use policies that students and teachers and parents of communities sign, sort of regulating technology use, identifying appropriate and inappropriate use, and laying out certain sets of penalties. But is that really enough? In places where students outside of school have rather free reign in their use of technology, whether it's because they're on a mobile phone and they can't be, or they're not really monitored, or they're in a local internet cafe perhaps with adults, whatever, that's sort of the Wild West environment. And if that's so, these special environments of technology use inside school offer a real opportunity to teach not only safe computer-related activities, but really responsible ones, because there's no way we can protect our children 100%, and teaching them the skills to protect themselves are what we should be talking about. Number 6, most kids aren't digital natives. This has been a theme here this week in Doha. The number of people I've heard who've invoked sort of the digital native hypothesis has been rather unfortunate. Now, we all understand the shorthand of what we're talking about here, that students, young people have a great facility with technology, and many of them are growing up with it in ways that older generations have not. Yet we see that in the academic research literature, certainly it's pretty clear over the last 8 years, people have poked a lot of holes in this hypothesis. Now, it might be one thing for academics to acknowledge this, teachers to acknowledge this, but at the policy level, we oftentimes see that this is almost unquestionably accepted with, I think, a lot of unfortunate consequences. So while this analogy may be over for those of us who spend a lot of time in this area, a lot of the people who make the big decisions about technology use, this hypothesis, again, is treated almost as a complex fact. Number 7, you'll never catch up. This is something we say to policymakers. Innovations in technology will always outpace your ability to innovate on the policy side. So you say, well, okay, even if we accept that, what can we do? We'd say that maybe if this is something you accept you're going to have to learn, you're going to be behind, and you build into your policy making, you build into your planning ways to learn from the process, because however you think things are going to go over time, no doubt there'll need to be changes as technology and as what technology brings about in society force changes on you. Number 8, cheating may well increase. You know, we hear a lot of rhetoric about the potential of technology to unleash the student imagination, and that's certainly true. Yet we see, and policymakers oftentimes are obsessed with this issue of cheating, in many cases rightly so, from basic copy-paste cheating to the type of cheating that we saw even at a place like Harvard earlier this year, with collaborative learning taking on perhaps a different meaning, or definitions of what cheating is and what collaboration are really being challenged in this age of technology use. You know, I was talking with the principal of a school in Asia where they bought some Turnitin software, and when they installed it on their network for the first time, in a graduating class of 123 students, they found that 121 had violated their plagiarism policy as stated, and had been carried over from sort of the pre-technology era. And they had to think about what to do, because they couldn't flunk all 121 students and only graduate 2 of them. And they really forced them to rethink how they thought about technology, and how they needed to think about both protecting themselves and how they thought about what it means to cheat and what it means to collaborate in this digital age. Number 9, like it or not, mobile phones and other things like tablets, but especially mobile phones, are coming fast. We see around the world, we have a list of over 55 countries where phones are banned in schools, and yet these are computing devices, increasingly powerful computing devices that students and parents are bringing themselves, are paying for themselves, and it does seem a shame not to think about how this installed infrastructure base, whether it's in someone's pocket or purse, can be used to help assist whatever it is you want to do as part of your learning, how it can complement other types of technology-related investments that are being done in school. You know, I was in the low-income community in Brazil about 5 weeks ago. 21 students in this class, all but one, and this was a low-income community, all but one had their own mobile phone with them. And at the same time, they were thinking about big investments to introduce technology in the classroom. And I looked around and I thought, there's already a lot of technology in this classroom. Let's just figure out, maybe it'd be useful to figure out what we can do with it. So, number 10, I'll leave this blank again. If there are pieces of conventional wisdom you think are worth challenging or exploring again, feel free to enter that in the chat room over there. So you may not agree with everything presented here. In fact, you know, I may not either, at least 100%. The purpose, the reason I bring up these sorts, or I put forward these sorts of lists to educational policymakers who are thinking about large-scale investments in technology is really to challenge them, or at least to suss out and identify where there might be conventional wisdom that's congealed in such a way so as to block perhaps useful planning and strategically useful planning processes going forward. So your thoughts, your reactions to any of this, any questions you might have, I'm happy to take any of those. For more information, I've put up some Twitter feeds that we use, both the official World Bank Educational Technology Twitter feed and my own. The World Bank one, you get more of the official view, and you get notified when the blog post goes out. The blog address is there, and I saw someone else put this in the chat stream, and then just our general educational technology website. And this is a question: why don't readers get this? Well, I wonder how many. In many cases, readers that we find, you have two types of sort of senior level educational policymakers. You know, in some places, the education ministry is the biggest employer, biggest single employer in the country. The teachers are the biggest single block, biggest single employee group, and there are all sorts of political pressures. And oftentimes, the education ministry is seen as a stepping stone to another quote-unquote more important job. In other cases where we have educators who are named or work themselves through the ranks, oftentimes, and unfortunately, sometimes the more nuanced understanding of some of these issues can be hard to convey, even if they understand them, to the people who hold the purse strings in the Ministry of Finance as well. So I'm happy to take some questions. Hopefully that was clear. Hopefully there wasn't too much static. I wanted to keep it about 25 minutes or so I think I have that as well. And I'm free to open it up to questions, either in the chat. If Steve, I don't know if that's how you prefer to take them, or via voice as well. I see a question about how local teachers push for change. This is I think a great question. And you know, we see a big dichotomy between sort of the decisions that are made at the top and the decisions that are made at the coalface or at the ground level. We did a survey a few years ago of technology use in education across Africa. And it was really enlightening in that we went to ministries of education, a number of them in early stages, and asked what was going on, and they gave us a list of things that were happening. And then we went out and actually surveyed and talked to especially non-governmental organizations, teachers groups, and did some basic media review, and we found lots and lots of things happening. When we went back to the central education authorities and said, this is what we found, in a number of cases, the response was, well, not quite shocked, but it was very clear that they weren't aware of what was happening indigenously on its own based on local decisions in their schools. And that, obviously, having that disconnect from what's actually happening, and presumably from the lessons from that experience, a disconnect between what's happening on the ground and what's happening at the central ministerial level is, let's say, problematic, to say the least.
So, Michael, I'd suggest that we can take questions in the chat, and also if someone wants to raise their hand, they can use that hand icon. It's the third one over in the participant window, raise your hand. Lucy's asking, what countries are the most progressive with ICT, and any major takeaways from the WISE conference?
Sure. So progressive. This is a great question. This is a question we get asked a lot, and it's really a question that you add. So we've been answering differently over time. I'm headed to Jordan tomorrow, here in the Middle East. In Jordan, about 6 years ago, was definitely held up as a model for technology use in the Middle East. In 2012, the question is it still a model? When you've made large investments in a certain approach, and things change and the technology changes, we find places that are at the leading edge that can find themselves drifting back to the middle rather quickly. We pay a lot of attention at the World Bank to a couple places. Places like Korea, which has had a large-scale, very systematic introduction of technology in education for a number of years. We think a lot of the approaches there are useful to consider, especially in the organizational or structural level. In a place like Uruguay, which is a little more, although it's a middle-income country from South America, so it is richer than a number of its neighbors, and certainly a number of countries in Africa. We do think that lessons emerging from there, where every primary school student has her own free laptop computer, and no student is meant to walk more than 500 meters to get on the internet. Some of the approaches that we see in those places, and I'm happy to talk about some of them, are really interesting. I already mentioned one of the major approaches that they've taken in Uruguay, which was whatever they do, they try to start doing it in the poorest communities, in the most rural communities first, figuring that if it works there, it will work in more advantaged communities. And this is in direct opposition to the way most technology rollouts take place, where they're done where they're easiest, they're done where there are the most perhaps critical demands, and then when they're rolled out to other places, they have to be modified oftentimes quite a bit. A focus on evaluation is something that we think is really strong in the Singaporean context. Singapore is a bit of an outlier in so many ways, a small island nation, quite wealthy, with really no natural resources other than a deep water port. And so there is an explicit interest in investing in people there. But the way that they've structured both their education system and specifically the use of technology, where they do a lot of action research to inform, and it is filtered back up to larger ministerial level policy making, we think is useful as well.
Michael, what about the Negroponte, Sugata Mitra kind of experiments in peer learning?
Yeah, so this is an experiment. So I've been to many OLPC implementations around the world, and I've been to I guess it would be the first hole in the wall experiment. The place is no longer there, so I was at the oldest around, the number 2 one. And there certainly is a lot to learn from there, and I can put up in the chat area a blog post I did about some visits at the hole in the wall experiment. One thing that's nice about hole in the wall is they do a lot of research and they publish and share a lot of what's done. There is much less research that's been developed specifically as part of the implementation of OLPC. We see more research being done by third parties. The Inter-American Development Bank is publishing a number of research papers based on the OLPC implementation in Peru. So far, and it's still early, they've found, I don't want to say that it's just, put computers in schools and hope for magic to happen. They do highlight a number of challenges that they've had in Peru, and they do highlight that there's been very little impact and a number of things that people would hope would be impacted. This issue of technology being introduced to create excitement or to create student engagement with learning that perhaps is lacking, that's a justification we see for many types of the sort of initiatives that at least purport to follow the philosophy of like Seymour Papert or Sugata Mitra. But oftentimes we think that the translation from what those guys have done and what they're saying to the way other people interpret it and put it in on the ground, we simply miss. Oftentimes we see that they miss a lot of the nuance. And in the hole in the wall experiment, a lot of people, and it makes sense. People look at the fact that it was computer put and just left in this slum community, and stuff started to happen. What they neglect to talk about, or neglect to acknowledge in many cases, and this is something the hole in the wall people themselves acknowledge quite readily, is that there were important investments in support activities for people in the community to help and support what students were doing and to observe what was happening and make changes as well. And there was a lot of investment in content that could be used in that type of environment. So to say that, as some people do, that there was just sort of put in a hole in the wall and left there totally, that's actually not what happened. Unfortunately, I think a number of initiatives that have taken inspiration from that very inspirational example oftentimes either deliberately or for some reason don't get the full story, and they implement only part of what those places really.
Alpha is asking, what things should be included in the professional development program for teachers at pre-service level to overcome these issues?
So pre-service level is in many ways the easiest level, where there is good pre-service teacher education. Now, in a lot of the places where we work in the World Bank, pre-service teacher education is extremely poor. And where it does occur, oftentimes it is much about being a good civil servant and basic how you can discharge your responsibilities related to basic administrative properties, and it has very little to do with approaches, exploration of various pedagogical approaches or content mastery. Now, in more middle income and upper middle income and more advanced countries, this isn't so much the case. But we do find that there's often a disconnect between what's still being taught in teacher training colleges and the environment that teachers find when they do go to schools. This is less of a case, less of a challenge perhaps still in more developed countries, but we see a challenge where you do, and a number of countries have sort of computerized their teacher training colleges, and they've offered a lot of training and support for new teachers that are going to then enter schools, and then they go to schools and there's no technology there at all, and there may be no technology for years. So we're a big fan of preparing people for the technology environment that they're going to have when they actually go teach, and making sure there's a linkage between what's happening in the teacher training environment, the pre-service environment, and what will actually be the circumstance in schools. Because technology changes can be so difficult, or can challenge teachers in various ways, we do find, and because most of the teachers, of course, are already in the system and will be for many years, we've seen when you have to make choices, and people have to make choices about various sorts of support mechanisms for teachers already in the system and continuing professional development for teachers related to technology. We oftentimes see that those are more, you get more bang for your buck from those, but that's not to deny the importance of things you can do at the pre-service level. One basic thing you can think about at the pre-service level we see that is useful is to use those teachers as champions in schools, champions related to technology use. This is an approach we've seen tried in scores of countries. The problem with that approach in many cases is that when you have a champion who's 20 years old or 23 or 25 going into a school with teachers who are 10, 20, 30 years older than she is, there are very real issues of status and of power and of culture that can make this idea, which in the abstract is very attractive, to have young teachers bring with them technology skills that they will help disseminate throughout the school, a bit more problematic in practice.
Michael, a lot of adult learners, those particularly who've been involved in the use of the web, find that their relationship to institutional learning organizations has changed. Do you think there's a larger shift here in terms of how we think about the role of institutions in learning?
I mean, certainly I think there is in this move, and we see sort of the explosion of interest in the MOOCs or the Mass Online Open courses, I think points to a couple things. And it points to this issue of, the delinking of accreditation from formal institutions. In a number of cases, schools didn't offer both education necessarily and accreditation. This is, in many parts of the world, a relatively new innovation over the last, let's say, 100 years or so. And I think what we're finding with increasing uses of technology by adult learners to help serve their own needs, I think highlights this tension between a mechanism by which to get some credit or acknowledgement of the skills or capacities or knowledge that they've developed, and the way formal institutions have gone about this practice. And I think this is only going to become more acute, and I think as we see more adult self-paced learners take advantage of online learning activities of various sorts, I think this is going to come into even starker focus.
Lucy wanted to ask again about the WISE conference. We hear rumors of big announcements. Has there been anything that you felt has been valuable to you this week?
Yeah, so a couple. So one, the WISE, the World Innovation Summit for Education, it's in its fourth year, and it's taken here on the shores of the Persian Gulf in the Middle Eastern country of Qatar. It is a bid in many ways to elevate sort of attention around to education and to what we need to be thinking about if we want to make, if we want to have the sorts of results from our education systems that we want. One of the things that they've been doing is last year, for the first time, they named a sort of a WISE laureate. So they gave out a prize, I think it's $500,000. They want to establish education, reward achievements in education with the sort of prizes that one sees, whether it's the Nobel Prizes in chemistry and physics and those sorts of things, or the Fields Medal in math. And so they named the second WISE laureate here, which is from an Indian NGO called Pratham, which we're very familiar with at the bank. That does a lot of very, very useful things working with local communities in education, especially in the western part of India. Actually, there was one of the best research studies of the use of technology in a low-income environment. One of the few randomized controlled trials was actually done related to was done by Pratham a number of years ago and was evaluated by the folks at the MIT Media Lab. So that I can put in the, or maybe someone else can put the announcement of the award to Pratham and their founder as well. The other thing this morning, yesterday morning, I guess, the Sheikha Moza, so the female leader, essentially like the Queen here, announced a large initiative to work to address the issue of out-of-school children, especially in conflict-afflicted zones around the world. There are estimates, 70 to 100 million students who actually aren't in education at all, and a fifth of those aren't in education at all because they're in places where there is endemic long-term conflict. And they've announced a series of partnerships and a series of linkages between initiatives that mean to help and support education efforts for children in these incredibly difficult environments, oftentimes conflict-afflicted environments. And that, I think, that's the big, really new announcement from WISE at the sort of structural level. A lot of interesting people are here sharing interesting experiences. We had a presentation this morning by Comrade Wolfram. You may be familiar with the Wolfram Alpha search engine. And he made a presentation that got a lot of people talking about the approach to mathematics education, specifically in the UK, but the challenges or the opportunities offered by technology. And despite the fact that we have this great computational tool at our fingertips, on our lap, on our desktop, in our pocket, we still do, our mathematics education still focuses a lot on basic computation by hand. And his argument is that there's one thing the computer does very well, and that's that sort of computation. There are other things it doesn't do as well that are more relevant to the real-life application of mathematics, and that's the identifying of specific problems and figuring out how to address them through math, and then also how to verify what you've done and present your result and verify it, because that's when a computer isn't especially good to do, well equipped to do, and that's where we should be spending placing more of our attention for students. There was a presentation from the head of the Plan Ceibal in Uruguay about the latest results from that work. There are all sorts of startups and private providers of education here, many of them technology-related, looking to fill gaps in education service delivery, whether it was in poor communities in India, where we heard from a number of folks who've been involved in private education initiatives at the very low end, where students and families are paying money to go to private schools, and when there are public schools in the area because they don't feel that the public schools are meeting their needs at all. And that's an interesting phenomenon we've seen in many places around the world, where there is a latent demand for education that, for whatever reason, whether it's for, I guess, many possible reasons, the public sector isn't able to meet the education needs of families, and they're actually paying out of very scarce resources to get education that they feel they can't get in the public sector. And oftentimes the way these indigenous groups market their private schools has a heavy component of technology use, and oftentimes real new technologies as well. So this is an emerging area that is of interest, and we think that it could be something where there is some innovation occurring. We do think it's an area that is deserving of research, so we can actually understand what's going on in a lot of these environments, and a lot of those types of people.
So if you have a question for Michael, please feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand. Michael, here in the U.S. we hear a lot about the connection between education and the economy of the country and the need to be competitive. It feels like that's a questionable direct relationship, meaning are there fuller ways to think about education that end up helping economies that aren't directly tying the results of education to economic output?
Yeah, so there is there's a lot of research and a lot of disagreement about the specific results of various types of investment in education on economic development. Over the long run, these are long-term investments, and where we do see positive impact, it's oftentimes, we're looking over 10, 20, 30-year time frames. There is, as you and I guess everyone probably knows, the rationale between a lot of initiatives to bolster or enable technology use in schools is because it would provide specific employment-relevant skills. And one of the questions I think we should be asking when we hear these things, and that may well be true, is are we preparing students with basic skills for the economy of today, or are we thinking about the types of skills they'll need in the economy of tomorrow when they get out of school, when they need to be retrained, when they need to retrain themselves over the years? And the focus on the acquisition of specific vocational type mechanical skills as a rationale for technology use. There isn't much data to support that as being a driver of economic development. It might be the case, but I think this belief that children are being educated for jobs increasingly that don't yet exist, if we don't know what those jobs are, if we want to prepare them for specific jobs rather than prepare them so that they can learn, so that they can teach themselves, so that they can continue to learn and engage with whatever new technology comes along their way, that may be a more productive approach.
So intriguingly, there's this connection between venture capital here in the U.S., money being invested in education, and the kind of lobbying dollars that are spent. And as soon as you say self-direction, the first thing that occurs to me is that there's no financial benefit to any entity for a student becoming self-directed. Is that an inherent conflict when money enters into the education system?
Yeah, I mean, potentially. Those are certainly, we look at the educational app environment, and whether this is sort of an anomaly because of the newness still, though it's not that new anymore, where groups are moving basically directly to consumers, whether it's directly to selling educational, let's say, services, whether they're small pieces of software apps to families. In East Asia, there is a phenomenon of cram schools or special after-school activities that in some cases children spend more time in these private sort of tutoring arrangements than they actually spend in public education. And those sorts of environments are very attractive to a lot of companies working in those markets. So I think it really depends on what the individual or the specific market looks like. That said, there's no doubt that technology vendors play in cases almost a decisive role, but a very prominent role in the decisions around technology-related purchases in many education systems around the world. That's not necessarily a 100% bad thing, because presumably these places do have some knowledge and expertise, but having those sorts of folks be the primary voice or one of the only voices in the room is obviously problematic, and we've seen that happen over and over again, where the push to sell and sell new things is leading to lots of rather unfortunate investments that have very long-term consequences.
Again, we've got a few minutes.
I don't know.
I think it's a difficult issue, and I think it extends beyond, at least from what I can see, it extends beyond vendors and maybe gets a little into testing companies. But I don't necessarily want to push you into an area that's not of interest.
Yeah, so the testing, I mean, we see a number of companies that used to call themselves education companies now call themselves assessment companies. So the line between that, certainly as you put more technology in school and where it's meant to enable the type of formative assessment that perhaps the digital trail of clicks and page views can offer, where we see that happening, and as a response to or as an anticipation of the fact that whether it's open educational resources or piracy or a combination of the two, or just business models that no longer are active, we see vendors really having to think about how they need to engage with schools in different ways. And when we get, assessment is essentially the heart of teaching, whether it's self-assessment, whether it's assessment via teacher or eventually summative assessment at the end. That's what really drives educational practices, or should drive them to many extents. And so as the guts of that and really the brains behind that are increasingly proprietary purview of vendors, we need to be asking ourselves to what extent we open up access to whether the algorithms that run these things, or we open up access to the data that is resulting from that, so that we have on the public side, so we have an understanding of what's actually happening. And from a competition standpoint, we're not in a place where we're locked into one system over time because one group really has the intellectual crown jewels to what's actually happening in the classroom.
So we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. You can put it in the chat or raise your hand. I'll keep asking questions until someone else does. So Karen Cater was one of our keynotes this week, and she mentioned what she felt was a direct connection between big data and personalization. Some of us were kind of skeptical about that. Are you seeing the use of big data in ways you feel is healthy and productive?
Yeah, so we're certainly seeing the potential for use. We're seeing a lot of excitement on the part of vendors. I've talked with 3 vendors today on this very topic where they see this as a huge area of growth. We don't see a lot of useful examples yet. We think they're coming. The most hyped one, I guess, in the U.S. is, the School of One, which is really not something that's been done at any scale. And some of the research findings that have come out recently have been, let's say, mixed. We do think this is something in Korea that they're spending a lot of time and energy on, and they really think that this is part of this will really be fundamental to the way they make decisions in their education sector, even in the near term. But we just don't yet see groups with that much experience yet that we can draw on to make really informed opinions. So we're very excited about it. And you're certainly right that vendors like it because it does seem to put some more central to the process.
You've got a final question for Michael? Please feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to clap for you here. It used to be easy to find the applause button in this environment. Now it's quite difficult. You hover over the smiley face and you go down to the applause icon. I have to say, Michael, this was the most thought-provoking session I've been to the whole conference, so I really appreciate your being a part of it.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to everybody. Hopefully, at least everyone took away at least something, even if it was a disagreement with something that I said that makes them think about something in a little bit of a new way.
Great. Be safe. Thanks for coming in from so far away and managing the time zone changes. Thanks, everybody, for attending. Please look at the schedule. We have another whole set of sessions coming up in about 6 minutes. Thanks, Michael. Bye now.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye, everyone.